Whether you call him the Apostle Paul or Rabbi Shaul, he is one of the most misunderstood and misrepresented characters of all time. Join us, Ryan Lambert, on the Jewish Road Podcast.
Every tribe, every tongue, Emmanuel, your king shall come. End of sorrows, end of pain, come and praise Creator's name.
Hey, welcome to the Jewish Road Podcast. My name's Matt Davis, and who are you?
Hey, I'm Mr. Davis Sr.
Mr. Davis Sr. It's amazing that you keep coming up with a new name every single time, just right there off the top of your head.
Yeah.
Well,
I'm Daddy, Papa.
There you go. Just one per show. That's all you get. We are here and blessed to be having a conversation with a new friend of ours, Ryan Lambert. Ryan, hello.
Hey, Matt, Ron, good to see you. Glad that we're making this happen.
Yeah, so we got to meet you at a recent conference that we were at. It was the Israel Summit. Was that right? Down there in
Israel, in
Franklin?
Supposed to be in Nashville. It was in Franklin.
Yeah. And what a crazy situation, right? Like it was supposed to be in Nashville, Tennessee, and lots of pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas, anti-Israel. I don't know, you could say pro on one side or anti on the other side. Were coming against and threatening the hotel, so much so that the hotel canceled reservations and we all got moved down to Franklin, where Dave Ramsey's place was at. He opened up the door to all of us, right?
That's right, man. And I felt like it was a net gain. I mean, nothing against the hotel where it was going to be near the airport. But let me tell you, I think Franklin, compared to having the conference in the airport area, and also that Dave Ramsey Center, man, I mean, I felt like we really got upgraded like 3 levels.
Yeah, we scored on that one.
Yeah, so thank God for that.
Yeah, so we're walking around trying to meet people, and we got to meet you, and you were sitting there at a table, and you had this orange book called The Weird Apostle, and we had to stop and say, well, what is that about, and who's this guy selling it? So before we get into the book, tell us about who you are, where are you, what are you, what's the backstory here?
Well, again, thank you guys for having me. And I enjoyed our time, the brief time that we had meeting in Nashville. But yeah, I am Ryan Lambert and I live in Atlanta, Georgia. And, I've got a story, an interesting story. And even I know we're going to talk about the book as well. But I grew up in a typical American Reform Jewish home in the Baltimore, Washington area. So, for folks that don't know what that description means, it means that, 90% of American Jews are Reform. Most Jews that Christians know are probably of a Reform mindset. So, very liberal, very, my Jewish identity was important. The ideas of tikkun olam, making the world a better place, having good principled values was very much a part of my upbringing and the Jewish values that were very central to my home. Went to Hebrew school, Sunday school at our synagogue, did the Jewish holidays. And so that's a very common American Reform Jewish upbringing. The area I grew up in, thankfully, I had a lot of Jewish friends and neighbors and so forth in the Baltimore, Washington area. My family's all from Baltimore. I grew up a little closer to Washington, D.C. in an area called Burtonsville, Silver Spring, that area. And so, a big part of my identity growing up as a Jew in America was that we didn't believe in Jesus. I didn't know really why that was. But that was definitely a pillar of, I guess, who we were as Jews. And that was, that wasn't really an issue for me because, again, I grew up in an area where there were a lot of Jewish people that had those same values and those same sort of pillars, I guess, in their life. And, my best friends growing up, or a number of them were, like me. They were Jews who didn't believe in Jesus, and we didn't really even think twice about it. So the biggest difference for us was we didn't celebrate Christmas, we didn't celebrate Easter, and we went to synagogue rather than going to church. But for all other intents and purposes, the way we ate, the way we lived, our values, the TV shows we watched, were just like everybody else. Well, when I was in high school, I was really, even before high school, I've always been, I guess, a sort of spiritually minded person and believed in God. But when I got to high school, I started dating a girl who was Seventh-day Adventist. And that was my first like immersion into like a family that was like really serious about their Christian faith. And that started, I would say, the journey for me that, of course, I'm going to have to really keep brief. But that was my journey into, let's just say, the Jesus movement. So to make a long story short, at that point, so I'm a junior in high school. I'm an athlete, baseball player. And I sort of am opened up now to the Bible, the New Testament, Christianity. And so went to my first time going to church was a Seventh-day Adventist church there in that area. And it was very different than what I thought it was going to be. I have no other way to describe it other than to say I found it very compelling. The message of the New Testament, the character of Jesus, what I heard, the people, it was all very just attractive to me and made sense. The Judaism that I experienced growing up, the way I would sort of describe it now, thinking about that phase of my life, it was just sort of uninteresting to me. And I'm sure part of that was just due to the phase of life I was in. But I've, certainly come to see Judaism very differently now. But all that to say, this step that I'm describing culminated in my senior year of college when I became a Christian, primarily through Baptist influences as a baseball player in college. So, of course, the next question people have is, well, what did your family think? Especially my mom. My mom coming from the Pikesville section of Baltimore, which from people who from that area, they're like, whoa, we know Pikesville's a very Jewish, religious, Orthodox area. And so, because I grew up Reform, which is much more liberal and open-minded. And my mom and dad and stepdad, they were all just a really wonderful, open-minded people. But still, it was difficult for them when I told them that I had become a Christian. And so at that point, I didn't understand Messianic Judaism. There was so much I didn't understand. I wasn't turning away from my Jewish identity, but I just know I believed in Jesus, and Christianity resonated with me. So
they weren't really like mutually exclusive, right? Like you could somehow, it wasn't you're choosing one or the other. In your mind, you could do both.
Yeah. It just, I didn't have all that sorted out. Things were just very basic. So, but that really, about a year after, I'm just going to say at that point, because my experience in coming to Jesus was very much in a Christian environment. So I think it's fair to say at that point, I wasn't identifying as a Messianic Jew. I wasn't, or a Jewish believer. I was very much identifying as a Christian. I went to a Christian church. Shortly after becoming a Christian, I went to a Christian seminary. I got ordained by the Southern Baptist Convention. All this was happening in my 20s now, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm skipping a lot of stuff, but I just went full throttle with being involved in Christianity. But about a year, this is important, and again, I know we got to keep moving here. About a year after I became a Christian, I met my first Messianic Jew. And that changed everything, because that began the path of me beginning to reconcile my Jewish identity with my faith in Jesus, which really, so that was like what I was 22 at that point. I'm 48 now. And that path, that sort of that I started on really has been sort of the main focus, other than family and kids and all, so forth. It's really been the main focus of my passion over the past 26 years of how does this work and fit together. So I got involved in Messianic Jewish ministry. I've had various roles in the world of Messianic Jewish ministry. I was a Messianic Jewish rabbi for 7 years, led a congregation here in Atlanta. I was involved in the Messianic Jewish missions side of things, not Jews for Jesus, but an organization like Jews for Jesus locally here in Atlanta. Worked for an organization called First Fruits of Zion, And then now I also work and help alongside Rabbi Jason Sobel, who I help him with his Israel tours and other things that he does. And so that was making a lot of pieces sort of fit together tightly there. But my passion now is very much centered around building bridges between Christians and Jews and helping people to understand that the differences between Jews, Christians, Messianic Jews, non-Messianic Jews are real. But I think that sadly for so long, those differences have been characterized by hostility. And I'm very passionate about, just increasing the dialogue and the relationships that I think can exist.
Yeah. So I'm curious for you. You've said a couple of times that you are a Christian. And so we've made a little bit of a big deal out of this in saying that, so some people I was a pastor in a church. And so a lot of people would ask me, well, you're Jewish, but you believe in Jesus, so you're a Christian, right? And I'd say, yes, but not how you what I think a lot of people mean. And I don't think you mean this, but that when you say that you're a Christian, that you are no longer Jewish. Right. Explain what that looks like for you.
Yeah. So, there's a book on my shelf. I don't want to get up to pull it off, but there's a book called Paul Was Not a Christian, right? And that's whoa, how could you say Paul was not a Christian? Well, what the book means and what you and I think mean when we refer to that is that the term Christian came to, even though it is mentioned 3 times in the New Testament, and so, but it's not a really widely used term, but it's sort of the term, even though it started in the Bible, it evolved over time to represent an identity very distinct from Jews, Judaism, Torah, and so forth. And so it's like you can be a Christian, but you can't be a Jew at the same time. The way that term largely developed. Again, that's not what I would say the biblical definition of that term is, but it didn't take long for the freight that went along with that term to represent something very different than something Jewish.
That's right. I think that's good.
Yeah. So for me, so I think when you say Paul was not a Christian, it's as if to say, or when I know a lot of Jewish people, today that are followers of Yeshua, they don't like that term Christian, or they don't like to be associated with that term because they're trying to restore the biblical sense in which being a Christian was simply being a follower of Christ. And you could be a Jewish follower or a non-Jewish follower. But they don't want to associate with the sense of the term that means that they are no longer Jews.
Yeah, I think that's what you grew up with is essentially the same kind of young life that I grew up with, coming from Brooklyn, and then we moved to California, went to Hebrew school, went to Sunday school. We were more conservative as a family, but there wasn't a conservative synagogue near us, so we went to the Reform synagogue. Yeah, and it was more than the religion. My connection to being Jewish, was more pronounced than the religious part of it. But what you're bringing up here and what you bring up in the book is, the interesting dilemma and battle that takes place for Jews and for Christians, because the Jews don't look at Paul and they don't see him as Jewish. He's kind of a traitor.
Right.
And the Christians look at Paul and they say, well, he's ours, he converted, and now he's on this side. Yeah. And he's no longer Jewish. And I don't think that's what you were bringing up in the book.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And it's I think, again, the reactions say that my family, my mom in particular, had when I told her that I believed in Jesus was that, she didn't really have a category for there being a way to follow Jesus while maintaining loyalty to being a Jew and even practicing Judaism as a follower of Christ. And again, I would say that for Paul, the early Jewish disciples, and in the modern Messianic Jewish movement, that those kinds of ideas are being rethought to say, hey, from a biblical standpoint, you absolutely, being a follower of Yeshua, a follower of the Messiah, can very much take place in a Jewish context.
Yeah. So let's dig in a bit. I love, you have the book on your shelf. I think we have it on ours too, but Paul was not a Christian. You really dove deep into the life of Paul. You wrote a book about him and you call it the weird apostle, that Paul is the weird apostle. So where did the fascination begin with Paul, and why do you call him the weird apostle?
Yeah, I think the interest and the passion when it comes to Paul has really been there probably for about 15 years. I guess I realized pretty early on that in many ways, for both Christians and Jews, the Jewishness of Jesus has been fairly well reestablished in modern times. I mean, among Jewish thinkers, and even I would say among a lot of just, Jewish people, Jewish family, just regular Jews, there's a pretty strong sense of awareness that Jesus was a Jew and that Jesus was a faithful Jew. Now, Jews, the dominant viewpoint among Jews still is that Jesus was not the Messiah, but he was a good Jew. That is a very common viewpoint. Some will say, okay, he was a bad Jew. He led things in a negative direction. But again, I think the more dominant Jewish view is that Jesus was a good Jew, just not the Messiah. Paul is a different story. Paul is still largely, to this day, seen as the real bad guy of the New Testament and within Christianity. Paul, so the common familiar, now we're going to start familiar versus weird, kind of thing, the familiar narrative among both Christians and Jews. And it's amazing how much overlap there is between how Jews think about Paul and how Christians, again, dominant, prevailing, traditional narratives. Because Jews have largely formulated the way they see Paul the way Christians have fed it to them through, conversations, commentaries, books, popular thinking, and so forth. So the idea here is that Paul was the true founder of Christianity. And if you read again, I'm giving the dominant narrative. If you read his letters, he said some very negative things. Circumcision is nothing. Uncircumcision is nothing. What matters is love and these kinds of things. He says that in Corinthians. He says that in Galatians. So he has in his letters in particular multiple statements that can be understood in a very negative way towards things that fundamental Jewish ideas, such as circumcision, Torah. He seems at times to be pitting the spirit against the law, the Torah. And so thus, because that's the way that Christian theology has largely also understood Paul, he's really seen in a negative light and as the one who at least stuck the fork in the road that led ultimately to the parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity. So all that to be said, back to your question, I think in part that has been a strong motivator for me because I think that narrative about Paul needs to be challenged. And I think that Paul's letters, understood in their context, and I think Paul's life as described in the book of Acts is really a little bit weird as compared to the familiar traditional narrative in that Paul was a faithful Jew. Paul kept Torah from the beginning to the end as the apostle to the Gentiles. He was, faithful to Torah. He absolutely affirmed circumcision, the Jewish holy days. He was hurrying to be in Jerusalem, if possible, for the day of Shavuot, the book of Acts says. So I think that it's very important. If we want to understand Paul better and his letters better, I think it's very important to put him back in his Jewish context. And I think, and then I'll come up for air here in just a second, I think it also, by reframing Paul and letting Paul be Paul in his Jewish terms, a big reason I wrote the book and a big reason I'm passionate about this, to answer your question, is because I think it can help improve relationships between Jews and Christians, respecting the differences, but also saying, hey, this guy right here, this apostle, he actually loved and upheld the Torah, and he wasn't seeking to replace Judaism with a new religion called Christianity. Because if the traditional narrative that Paul, was seeking to promote Christianity as a replacement of Judaism, it really does create, I think, an insurmountable barrier regarding relationships between Christians and Jews. So for all those reasons, I'm very passionate about Paul in my own sort of way. And that's the sense in which I think he needs to be made weird, in that we need to defamiliarize ourselves with the traditional Paul and make him a little weird by returning to a less familiar version, but I would say a more historically and biblically faithful view of the apostle to the Gentiles.
Would you say that Paul, in trying to accomplish all of this, is really walking a tightrope?
I don't know that Paul would, from the standpoint of, from Paul's perspective, which is always a dicey thing, to say what was Paul's thinking. I think that Paul I don't think he had any notion that he was starting a movement that would eventually divorce itself from Jews, Judaism, and Torah, circumcision. I think Paul was but I think Paul had a personal encounter with God. He was persuaded that because of Jesus' death and resurrection, that the age of the Jewish prophets, the age that Isaiah spoke of, that the redemption for the world had broken in, and that the time was near when the world as we know it would change. So I don't think he really saw that as, hey, I'm trying to walk a line between Judaism and Christianity. There was no Christianity at that time. It was just,
right.
This was a Jewish movement that was now welcoming non-Jews into the family of God. Mm-hmm. And so that's how I see it.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I have always characterized that myself as the fact that when we look at Judaism and what happened when the Messiah came, and then all of the apostles and the letters, that there's a continuity between Jewish history and salvation history. And that's where Paul was, I think, walking along. That's what you're saying.
He's more at the fulcrum instead of a tightrope, right? Like he's balancing the two.
I like that, fulcrum. I think Paul was persuaded that history was at a turning point. I think that he was, the end of the ages had broken in, that a new era, but a new Jewish era, not an era that was starting, but that according to Jewish expectation, based on the prophets. And as a good Pharisee, Paul was well versed and grounded in the prophets. I mean, in the book of Romans alone, he has 15 direct quotations from the book of Isaiah, quotations, not to mention other quotations from other books, as well as plenty of allusions to the prophetic literature. My point is that Paul knew his Bible, and as he was articulating his, the implications of Jesus to his Gentile audience, he was persuaded that it was very consistent and harmonious with his Pharisaic and biblical education in the, I'll say, Old Testament, or Hebrew Bible, Tanakh, whatever term we want to use. But he thought, bottom line, everything he was promoting was a thoroughly Jewish concept. The big difference between Paul and his Jewish contemporaries who didn't agree with him was that, they just felt like, hey, Paul said the time is now, and they didn't agree the time was now. They had a big difference about, hey, he says because of Jesus' death and resurrection that the prophetic era had dawned. They were not persuaded, or at least most of them.
Yeah, you talk a little bit in the book on Paul's view of time, his expectation of the Messiah's return, and almost this wartime stance, right? Everything, there's an urgency to Paul's message that really impacts how it comes out and how it's delivered. How would you characterize that, and why he would have been surprised that 2,000 years later, where the Messiah has not returned?
Yeah, it's a great question, Matt, and I think it's an absolute key to understanding Paul, and that is that I don't think Paul was playing the long game. He has many statements, that indicate that he thought that the end was near. He literally says, the Lord is at hand. He talks famously, in 1 Thessalonians 4, us who will be alive and together will see the coming of the Lord. So he even includes himself with the Thessalonians in that expectation. And I'm well aware that there are all kinds of interpretive traditions about how to understand those texts. But, again, I think if you put the pieces together, we've got a lot of statements from Paul and just an overall tone in his letters that he thought Yeshua was coming back super soon in his lifetime. And so therefore, I think that is important as we are seeking to understand him in our times, to remember that, there are certain things that you advise. Don't get married. Don't, do some of the things. Paul wasn't advising, or at least his audience. He was writing letters, and I think that's real important too, Matt and Ron. Is that Paul was a letter writer. He wasn't necessarily writing what he thought was going to be theology, which would be dissected for the next 2,000 years. He was writing letters to real communities, and so. But I think the time factor is really important to take into consideration as we're seeking to understand him and apply his letters today.
Yeah. So one of the pieces that I think is interesting is we miss this perspective that Paul is including the Gentiles into this conversation, right? Mm-hmm. He's making room for the Gentiles, not ever thinking that a couple hundred years later that the Jews would now be kicked out of this thing that they really started in the very beginning.
Yeah.
And so there's even just a bit of where do you stand today as you look at what's happening across the planet with this epicenter of what's going on in Israel, and we see what's happening in the church, the American church today. That they're seeing, from our perspective, we see there's some people that are gung-ho and love Israel and love the work that we're doing, but then there is a much bigger group of people that are ignorant and indifferent to what is going on and really forgotten about the roots of their faith. What does this look like, maybe a bit more through your perspective, but Paul's perspective as well?
Yeah, I think that I think that Paul would, and I share how Paul thinks on this, but I think that Paul would be. I think there's a lot of things Paul would look at in how the followers of Yeshua are living today, and I think there's a lot he would be happy with. I think he would be very happy with the tremendous amount of good that, let's just say, the church is doing today. In the world, and in the name of Jesus, how many things have been done to make the world a better place. I think that but when it comes to how the church relates to Israel by and large. And again, we all know on this, the three of us, especially being at that meeting in Nashville, that there are a lot of Christians that would give their life for the Jewish people and for the nation of Israel. But I think because maybe even in Paul's lifetime, I think actually in the book of Romans, this idea of replacement theology, this zero-sum thinking began to creep in to the Jesus movement, where I think it really comes out in Romans 11, to where something happened to where these non-Jewish followers of Jesus were thinking that because a place had been made for them within what Paul referred to, the metaphor he used in Romans 11 was the olive tree, because they have been brought in and grafted in, to use his language, into this olive tree, and Jews have been maybe placed aside. There's different ways to interpret Romans 11, and that's an incredibly important chapter in an incredibly important letter. But I think that the thrust of what Romans is all about is he's writing to a non-Jewish audience in Rome because he's seeing arrogance creeping in. Apparently, the Jewish response to Jesus was not what Paul or a lot of people were expecting. The Gentile response was very strong, and the Gentiles were being brought in, but the Jews were sort of in this state, from a Jesus movement perspective, they were sort of in this state of unfaithfulness. They were, to use Paul's metaphor, they had stumbled. But Paul said they have not fallen. They've been bent or maybe cracked on this olive tree, and room has been made for these non-Jews to come into this olive tree. But what Paul was observing, or at least hearing, not observing because he hadn't been to Rome, what he observed is that arrogance was creeping in among the non-Jews. And Paul's message in Romans is, don't be arrogant against the natural branches. This is a temporary thing. All Israel will be saved. Or as Mark Nanos translates, all Israel will be protected. Again, there's different ways to render. Again, these are critical verses. But how we understand these texts, because Paul addresses the issue that you just brought up. But sadly, the very thing that Paul advised against in Romans is the very thing that the church ended up, the very crime that the church continued to perpetuate and multiply, many, many times over, in seeing themselves as replacing the natural branches, and almost, seeing, hey, they're cracked, they're broken, maybe they're even ripped off the tree, thrown aside. And that has continued in many ways. And again, I don't want to sit here and just bash the church or Christians, but just this is the foundational thinking that has created the separation between Jews and Christians, Christianity and Judaism, and has sort of perpetuated this anti-Jewish, anti-Israel, and sometimes anti-Semitic action towards Jews and Judaism. Well, that was a very long and sort of theological answer, but that's important because it's sort of the thinking that has affected, I would say, the Christian either indifference or the Christian negativity towards Israel and the Jews. And I think it's a misreading of Paul, a misreading of Romans, and to the degree that we can correct that, got to make Paul weird again, because again, that narrative is so familiar and entrenched, the negative one, but we need to change that. And as we do, I think it will improve the way that Christians relate to Jews, and they're going to understand Paul better by making these corrections. Yeah, and it will, and I think it will translate, if you can undergird and affect these ideas, it will then translate into actions. Okay.
Yeah.
And if the attitude, let me just say one more thing. If the attitude of the church is, hey, like Paul said, they may be in a state of unfaithfulness, but Paul's saying, show them mercy because I've been shown mercy as a non-Jew and have been brought into this olive tree contrary to nature. I need to be thankful for this mercy, and I need to show it towards Jews, regardless of whether they believe or not. That mindset changes everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, sorry guys, I got super theological and geeked out on y'all there, but
that's great, and I think we agree with everything that you're saying. And it's true, because that replacement theology has really become a problem throughout this entire age, to the extent that 75% of churches today are replacement theology. But if the Jewish community, if you're going to affect the Jewish community, I think that's what you're saying, is if it doesn't have any resemblance to anything Jewish, if there hasn't been that continuity that the Jewish people can see, it doesn't look Jewish, Jesus doesn't look Jewish, then Paul was a traitor.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Ron. It's a big problem. Again, thankfully, in our times, we are seeing some of these narrative and theological points. Things are starting to shift. And I presented a very negative picture at the beginning of how Jews think about Paul, but even that is shifting to now to where you have a minority of Jewish non-messianic Jewish theologians that are and thinkers and historians that are starting to see, hey, you know what? Even Paul, it's not just Jesus was Jewish. Paul was a faithful Jew. And so that's good. And in my opinion, we need to continue to push that forward, because there are just many, many good things that will come from that.
Yeah. Given what the circumstances were in the first century and who Paul was ministering to, and, maintaining his Jewishness, which was really the only thing he knew, right?
Yes.
Where do you think he would find himself today, given 2,000 years of history that's gone by, and now you have the synagogue and you have the church, and where does Paul go?
Yeah, and Ron, that's an excellent question. I want to answer that. Matt, there was one other level to the question you asked that I wanted to comment regarding. You hit on something, and I don't think I really addressed it clearly enough about just Paul and his message to Gentiles, right? And just how I think that's a big part of why I use the term weird in the weird apostle, because, Paul, it's not just that we want to make, or I'm trying to make Paul weird again in comparison to the traditional narrative. It's that there are aspects in which, even though Paul's message was a message very consistent with Jewish expectation, it was still weird in his time, in the sense that, again, he was saying that the end was near, but then also his gospel to non-Jews was telling them, hey, you got to leave idolatry, you've got to leave paganism, you got to give allegiance because of Jesus' death and resurrection. You need to now give allegiance to the Jewish God, but you don't convert and become Jews. That was a weird, radical, and even dangerous message coming from a Jewish teacher. So I think that can't be overstated, how radical Paul's message was to call non-Jews to give up the gods, the Greco-Roman pantheon of gods, leave their idols, and give allegiance to the Jewish God as non-Jews. Got him in big trouble. Hot water everywhere he went. That's a whole nother podcast, but it's a huge, huge thing. And you kind of were alluding to that, so I want to make sure I say that. Ron, to your question, where would Paul find himself? Wow, that to me is quite a dilemma, because clearly we say Paul was not a Christian. Well, that's a shocking, and that's a statement meant to jolt, but of course it's not entirely true. Paul was a passionate follower of Christ, of Yeshua, of the Messiah. So I think that was just very central to who he was. However, Paul was also a very faithful Jew. When he came back from one of his journeys out into the diaspora in Acts 21, famously, he's being accused by some of the local Jerusalem Jews of, teaching other Jews to forsake Moses. And James, himself testifies that Paul, he says in Acts 21, he says, Paul, you yourself also walk orderly, keeping the Torah. So I think that knowing what we know about Paul, I feel very confident that Paul would absolutely be connected to Jews and the Jewish community and the synagogue, but I think he would also seek to maintain a strong connection with non-Jews as well, and with Christians, because that was central to who he was. But again, let me just say this to round out the answer to your question. Paul didn't imagine a situation that really presented itself not just 2,000 years later, but really probably within 50 years after Paul, to where this separation between the Jesus movement and Jews, Judaism, and Torah was already beginning. That wedge was already coming in. I think 50, maybe in the generation or two after Paul would have been a bit lost. Like, whoa, this is not what we envisioned.
He never expected a holy Gentile church.
I just don't think it was in his mind. I don't think it was in any of the other apostles' mind. I don't think it's hinted at really in Acts. And so the only hint I get, or personally that I sense, is, as I emphasized earlier, was in Romans. I think Paul is detecting, he's heard that arrogance among the non-Jews has been entering in, and he's wanting to absolutely stamp that. But that message was not, we don't know how the actual recipients received it, but what we do know is that in the generations that received Romans later on, they absolutely got Paul's message 180 degrees wrong. They got the complete opposite message. Because the message they got, and the prevailing reading of Romans, is that the gospel supersedes Judaism. Christians are now the people of God. Israel as an entity has been redefined as those now include that, Israel is now those who are Christ followers, and the branches that the natural branches have been ripped off the tree, and maybe one day will be regrafted in if they embrace Jesus. But again, Paul says that's problematic on multiple levels, not least of which is at the ends of Romans 11, Paul affirms that, that they are beloved, they, meaning his Jewish brothers who don't embrace Jesus. They are beloved for the sake of the followers, and the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable.
Right.
That statement doesn't really jive with how Romans and Paul has been typically understood.
Yeah, I agree. And what caught me, one of the things you were saying is that Paul's message to non-Jews is that they have to leave their paganism and they have to come to the Messiah. Paul, even in Ephesians, characterizes the Gentiles as those who were apart from God, without God, and without hope in the world. Whereas, on the other hand, you have the Jewish people who have God's word, they have the Torah, they have the temple, they have the services, they have the promises, they have everything. But both of them, the ones coming from nothing and the ones coming from everything, have to come to this one place.
That's beautifully said. And I think another way of saying what you are just, I think, said so well, and you were pulling together multiple passages there, which are powerful. I think what happened with Paul is that the way his letters were received, it led to a parting of the ways. I think Paul's mission and message was intended to join the ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he would be absolutely flabbergasted, aghast, and brokenhearted to see how his letters have been used to create such division between Jews and non-Jews, because it's completely antithetical to his intent. It was to bring Jews and Gentiles together under the worship of the one true God, the God of Abraham, to bring them in. Yeah.
Would love to talk more. We're running out of time, but I wanted to, when you spend so much time studying a character and looking at them, and I think sometimes we relegate the characters of the Bible as just storybook VeggieTale characters. Paul's a real dude, and if you were going to sit down with him and have a cup of coffee, is there a question that you would ask him that would be clarifying? Is there something that you would say to him now 2,000 years later, and just kind of studying him? What's that interaction look like for you?
Yeah. No, wow, what a great question. And I'm pretty sure that I'm going to have an answer. My answer later is probably going to be different than what it is now, but I love that. And I think, let me just go into it by saying, I think you're absolutely right. We tend to mythologize some of these biblical characters, and we tend to make Paul out as if he was, and I meet people all the time. Oh, I wish I just had Paul's courage and Paul's strength. I think Paul was a very complicated person. We know in 2 Corinthians 11 that he, talked about having sleepless nights. He mentioned anxiety for all the churches. I think Paul was really amazing at overcoming his fears and doing God's will by the power of the Spirit, despite his fears. But I think he was very human. I don't know, Matt, if he would have been the most fun to sit down and have a cup of coffee with, or a beer with, or whatever one's chosen drink is. I would certainly love to have that with him. What question would I ask Paul? I think I would just probably go general, like, hey, Paul, where have we gone wrong? What was really the heart of your good news message? How would you sum it up? I think those are the kinds of questions. I mean, I have individual verses. What was the blinding in 2 Corinthians 3? To me, 2 Corinthians 3 is the most enigmatic Pauline chapter. It's really difficult to understand what he was talking about in 2 Corinthians 3, and with the blinding in the synagogue, and oh man, that chapter gets me in knots. And it's not because I haven't studied it in depth for years. I just don't have a good answer. So I'd probably ask him about 2 Corinthians 3, what was going on there. But I would just want to, get to know, like, the heart of what he really felt like his message was all about. But I think it's good. Yeah.
Well, Ryan, we've been blessed by the conversation and blessed by the book, and would suggest that people pick up The Weird Apostle. How does one get their hands on this?
Sure.
If they're not going to a conference to see you in person?
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And thank you guys for having me. Of course, they can, the book is available hard copy or on Kindle on Amazon. So you can just order it directly on Amazon. If you do, I would be grateful for a review, because that really helps. Even if you don't like it or want to challenge it. Or another thing you could do, if somebody wants a signed copy of the book, they can contact me through my website, Ryan Lambert, RyanLambertForum.com, and just send a message through there and just say, hey, I heard you on the Jewish Road podcast, and I'd love a signed copy. And then I'll just make arrangements and with you, and they can, and I'll do a signed copy as well with a personalized message.
As people who have the signed copy, I'd say that's a pretty good deal there.
Yeah.
Not bad.
Yeah, no, thank you. I would love to do that.
My signed copy.
Oh, yeah, that's the real deal.
So we'll put all those links in our show notes, and if people want to get in touch. But Ryan, we're thankful for accidentally meeting you, a new friend. Couldn't believe there's so few of us in the world that we thought, like, how is it that, like, most of the time when you get together with other Messianic Jews in the world, you say, oh, well, you know this person. Oh, yeah. We all know each other. But we didn't know you. So how did that happen for all these years?
It's kind of strange because I get around, you guys get around. It's just, I don't know. I guess it was God's appointed time for us to meet. And I'm really grateful because I hope that we can just continue to get to know each other and encourage each other.
Yeah. So we were on the opposite sides of the revolving door.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Well, Ryan, thank you for joining us on the Jewish Road. And folks, go get the book and let's keep talking about it. And shalom, my friend.
Thanks, Matt and Ron. Thank you.